Some say it's a myth, others say it migrates. Witnesses describe the same impossible thing, a towering, foul-smelling predator with eyes like coals and strength beyond reason. Governments blame bears, big cats, even birds. But the damage is real, the disappearances are permanent, and the tracks never match known species. From mutilated livestock and shattered campsites to vanishings no search team can explain, this video dives into 6 terrifying Bigfoot encounters told through survivor accounts, forensic details, and deadly consequences. Cypress Knoll RV Resort sat like a small oasis of suburban comfort amid the wild expanses of north-central Florida, just 15 miles southeast of Ocala. Greg Renshaw had been looking forward to this kind of tranquility when he and his wife Linda pulled their 30-foot Winnebago into Site 47 3 months earlier. After 35 years managing a hardware store in Michigan, Greg craved nothing more than morning coffee on his fold-out chair and evening barbecues behind their rolling home. Linda spent her days reading mystery novels in the shade, while Greg tinkered with small repairs around their temporary neighborhood. They had made friends with other residents and fallen into the comfortable rhythm of retirement community life. The evening of June 2nd, 2025 began like any other. Greg fired up their portable propane grill around 6:30, planning to cook the thick ribeye steaks Linda had picked up from a local grocery store that morning. The temperature had cooled to a pleasant 82 degrees after a typical Florida afternoon thunderstorm, and a light breeze carried the earthy scent of wet vegetation from the surrounding forest. Linda set up their folding table with paper plates and plastic cups while Greg seasoned the meat, both of them chatting about their plans to visit their daughter in Tampa the following weekend. Around 7:15, as Greg flipped the steaks and Linda went inside to fetch the potato salad from their refrigerator, a sharp metallic crashing sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the park. Greg paused, spatula in hand, listening as the noise repeated, a rhythmic banging like someone beating on the side of a metal building with a sledgehammer. He called to Linda that he was going to check on their neighbors, assuming perhaps someone's awning had come loose in the earlier storm winds. Greg walked toward the source of the commotion, following the winding road past 3 other RVs toward Site 52, where he knew an elderly widower named Frank Kowalski kept a vintage Airstream trailer. The banging had stopped, but as Greg rounded a curve in the road, he could see Frank's silver trailer rocking back and forth, as if something massive was shaking it from the outside. The motion was violent and deliberate, far too forceful to be caused by wind or any mechanical failure. Standing beside the trailer, Greg saw what appeared to be an enormous figure covered in dark, matted hair. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders broader than any human Greg had ever seen. Its arms were disproportionately long, ending in hands that seemed to be clawing directly through the aluminum siding of Frank's trailer. The thing's head was cone-shaped and sat low between its massive shoulders, and even from 30 yards away, Greg could hear its labored breathing, deep, raspy sounds that seemed almost human, but wrong in every fundamental way. Greg stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. The creature suddenly stopped its assault on the trailer and turned in his direction. Even in the fading daylight, Greg could make out features that looked disturbingly human-like. 2 eyes that reflected the light from a nearby lamppost, a broad nose, and what might have been a mouth hidden beneath the dark hair covering its face. For several seconds, man and creature stared at each other across the quiet campground. The spell broke when Linda's scream pierced the evening air from behind Greg. She had followed him and now stood pointing at the massive figure beside Frank's trailer. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and in one fluid motion, it pivoted and crashed through the landscaped area between 2 campsites. Greg watched in amazement as the thing effortlessly overturned a golf cart parked near the park's recreation building, the small vehicle flying through the air as if it weighed nothing. The creature then turned toward a storage shed that housed lawn maintenance equipment. Greg later told investigators that the thing seemed to attack the wooden building out of pure rage, tearing boards loose with its hands and kicking holes through the walls. The entire assault lasted less than 30 seconds before the creature crashed into the tree line and disappeared into the swamp. Greg and Linda ran back toward their RV to call 911, but their phones showed no signal, a common problem in the rural area. Greg drove his pickup truck to the park office where manager Susan Martinez was already on the phone with emergency services. Other residents had heard the commotion and were gathering in small groups, everyone talking at once about strange sounds and something large moving through the campground. When deputies from the Marion County Sheriff's Office arrived 40 minutes later, they found 3 RVs with significant damage. Frank Kowalski's Airstream had deep gouges scraped through its side, as if massive claws had raked across the metal. The golf cart was found upside down 30 feet from where it had been parked, and the storage shed looked as though it had been hit by a small tornado. The most disturbing discovery came when deputies searched the area behind Troy Wexler's Class A motorhome in Site 49. Troy, a retired construction worker from Ohio, was found dead near his picnic table. The 63-year-old man's neck had been snapped, and both arms were twisted at impossible angles. The medical examiner would later determine that the injuries required tremendous force, far beyond what any human could generate. Deputies found enormous footprints in the soft earth around the damaged RVs. The prints measured nearly 18 inches in length and showed what appeared to be 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth of the impressions suggested something weighing at least 600 pounds had made them. Crime scene photographers documented everything, but the official report filed 2 weeks later attributed the incident to a rogue black bear, despite the fact that the largest black bears in Florida typically weigh less than 400 pounds and leave completely different tracks. Most of the 37 residents at Cypress Knoll packed up and left within the following month. Greg and Linda sold their Winnebago to a dealer in Gainesville and moved into a 5th-floor condominium in nearby Bellevue. Greg still barbecues on their small balcony, but he admits to Linda that he prefers having concrete and steel between himself and whatever roams the Florida wilderness after dark. The park never reopened. Susan Martinez sold the property to a development company that cleared the land for a shopping center, though construction was delayed indefinitely due to what planners described as unstable soil conditions in the area closest to the forest. The Wairoa region of New Zealand's North Island remained one of the country's most remote wilderness areas in 1991, where dense native forests stretched for miles without a single road or permanent settlement. Te Kohatu Gorge Campground sat at the end of a barely maintained logging track, 43 kilometers from the nearest town of Frasertown. The campground consisted of nothing more than a few cleared sites beside a rushing stream, with pit toilets and a single water spigot serving the handful of adventure tourists who ventured into the isolated valley each year. Henry Looper had been guiding adventure tours through New Zealand's backcountry for 8 years when he agreed to lead 5 German backpackers into Te Kohatu Gorge for a 2-night camping expedition in March 1991. The group consisted of university students on holiday: Klaus Brenner, Ingrid Hoffmann, Werner Schultz, Greta Zimmermann, and Andreas Mueller, all experienced hikers who had specifically requested the most remote location Henry could offer. They wanted to experience New Zealand's wilderness without encountering other tourists, and Te Kohatu Gorge certainly provided that isolation. The group hiked into the gorge on a clear Wednesday morning, following an old deer track that paralleled the stream for 6 kilometers before reaching their intended campsite. Henry had chosen a spot on a small rise above the water, where a gap in the canopy allowed enough sunlight for their tents and provided a clear view down the valley. The German tourists were enthusiastic about the pristine setting, taking photographs of the massive trees and listening to Henry explain the ecological significance of the old-growth forest. Their first night passed without incident, though Henry noted that the usual forest sounds seemed muted. Typically, he would expect to hear moorpork calls, the rustling of possums in the canopy, and the occasional grunt of a wild pig foraging in the undergrowth. Instead, an unusual quiet settled over their camp after sunset, broken only by the constant murmur of the stream and the occasional crack of settling timber in the darkness. The second day brought overcast skies and intermittent drizzle that made the forest floor slippery and treacherous. The group spent most of the day exploring the gorge bottom, where massive fallen logs created natural bridges across the stream and ferns grew to enormous proportions in the humid environment. Henry pointed out native birds and explained traditional Maori uses for various plants, while the Germans documented everything with their cameras and notebooks. As evening approached on their second night, Klaus Brenner and Werner Schultz volunteered to collect firewood from the forest surrounding their campsite. Henry typically discouraged campers from venturing far from the group after dark, but the two young men were confident in their outdoor skills and promised to stay within shouting distance. They headed into the trees around 6:30, carrying flashlights and a small axe for cutting kindling. When Klaus and Werner failed to return after an hour, Henry organized the remaining group members to search for them. They called out repeatedly and swept their flashlight beams through the forest, but received no response. Near a massive Raimu tree, about 200 meters from camp, Ingrid Hoffman discovered torn fragments of Werner's distinctive red rain jacket, caught on low branches. The fabric appeared to have been ripped with tremendous force, and nearby they found drag marks in the soft earth, two parallel grooves as if something had been pulled deeper into the forest. Henry followed the drag marks for nearly half a kilometer up a steep ridge, the rest of the group staying close behind him. The trail led through increasingly difficult terrain, where they had to climb over fallen logs and push through dense supplejack vines. At the top of the ridge, the drag marks suddenly ended near a cluster of ancient totara trees. Henry later reported that they stood in that spot for several minutes, listening to deep, rhythmic breathing sounds that seemed to come from the darkness between the massive trunks. But despite their powerful flashlights, they could see nothing that might be making the noise. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity before gradually fading away, leaving the group standing alone on the ridge with no sign of their missing companions. Henry made the decision to retreat to their campsite and attempt to reach help at first light, though he knew the nearest ranger station was a full day's hike away. The group spent a sleepless night huddled in their tents, listening to strange sounds in the forest around them. Henry heard what sounded like heavy footsteps circling their camp, accompanied by occasional low grunts that definitely did not come from any native New Zealand animal he recognized. Shortly before dawn, Greta Zimmerman disappeared from her tent without making a sound. Her sleeping bag was empty when Ingrid checked on her, and the tent zipper was pulled completely open from the outside. Henry made the difficult decision to abandon their remaining gear and hike out immediately with the two surviving members of the group. They reached the logging road after 8 hours of hard travel, where Henry's vehicle was still parked where they had left it 3 days earlier. The drive to Frasertown took another 2 hours over rough tracks, and Henry immediately contacted the New Zealand police and local search and rescue services. Search teams spent 4 days combing Te Kohatu Gorge, using helicopters and trained tracking dogs to cover the rugged terrain. They found additional torn clothing and disturbed ground in several locations, but no trace of the 3 missing Germans. The official investigation concluded that the hikers had likely fallen into one of the gorge's deep ravines during their nighttime firewood gathering, and their bodies were probably buried under debris or washed downstream by spring floods. Henry Looper provided detailed statements to investigators, describing the drag marks, the breathing sounds, and the systematic way his clients had vanished. However, his account was largely dismissed as the product of stress and darkness-induced imagination. The case was officially closed 6 months later, with the 3 Germans listed as accidental deaths due to falls in difficult terrain. Local Maori from the Wairoa region were not surprised by the incident. Tribal elder Rawiri Hanare told a Gisborne newspaper that his people had warned against camping in the deeper parts of Te Kohatu Gorge for generations, but Pakeha rarely listened to such advice. He described Takai Hoha as a guardian of the ancient forest, something that did not tolerate intrusion into its territory. Henry Looper never guided another tour into the New Zealand wilderness. He moved to Auckland 6 months after the incident and found work in construction, though friends reported that he suffered from severe insomnia and would often wake up screaming from nightmares about breathing sounds in the darkness. On quiet nights, he claimed he could still hear the low howls that had followed them during their terrifying retreat from Te Kohatu Gorge. The campground was permanently closed by the Department of Conservation in 1992, officially due to budget constraints and lack of visitor interest. Local residents noted that even experienced deer hunters began avoiding the area, reporting an overwhelming sense of unease whenever they ventured too deep into the gorge. Santo Vento Wildlife Preserve occupied 12,000 hectares of Atlantic forest remnant in southern Bahia State, Brazil, where dense tropical vegetation created an impenetrable wall of green that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Camila Rodriguez had worked as a conservation officer for the Bahia State Environmental Protection Agency for 6 years when she received reports of unusual cattle mutilations on farms adjacent to Santo Vento in August 2004. Local ranchers described attacks unlike anything they had previously encountered. Cattle found torn in half with wounds that appeared too severe and precise to be the work of jaguars or other known predators. The incidents occurred along a 5-kilometer stretch where sugarcane fields met the forest edge, always at night, and always involving the complete disappearance of large portions of the carcasses. Camila had investigated numerous wildlife conflicts throughout her career, from jaguar attacks on livestock to problems with aggressive wild boars destroying crops. She understood the ecological pressures that drove predators to seek easy prey among domestic animals. But the reports from Santo Vento described something fundamentally different. Rancher Joaquim Pereira claimed that whatever killed his cattle possessed strength far beyond any native Brazilian predator, and the attack patterns suggested intelligence rather than simple predatory behavior. The first site Camila examined was Pereira's ranch, where a full-grown bull had been found separated into 2 distinct pieces near a wooden fence that bordered the sugarcane field. The bull weighed approximately 800 kilograms, yet something had apparently lifted the rear portion of the animal and carried it nearly 50 meters before abandoning it at the forest edge. The front portion remained where the attack occurred, with wounds that appeared to have been made by claws longer and more powerful than those of any jaguar Camila had documented. More disturbing were the tracks she discovered in the soft earth around the attack site. The footprints measured 43 centimeters in length and showed clearly defined toe impressions that looked disturbingly human-like, though far larger than any human foot could produce. The depth of the impressions indicated something weighing at least 400 kilograms had made them, and the stride length suggested a bipedal gait rather than the 4-legged movement pattern of known predators. Along the wooden fence that separated Pereira's pasture from the sugarcane field, Camila found what appeared to be claw marks scraped deep into the hardwood posts. The marks occurred at a height of nearly 3 meters above ground level, indicating whatever made them stood much taller than any Brazilian predator. She documented and measured each mark, noting that they appeared to have been made by digits rather than conventional animal claws. Camila decided to conduct overnight surveillance to document whatever was responsible for the attacks. She positioned herself in a hunting blind, overlooking the area where 3 separate incidents had occurred, accompanied by her assistant Paulo Vasconcelos, a recent forestry graduate who had joined the Environmental Protection Agency 6 months earlier. They arrived at their observation post just before sunset on August 23rd, equipped with night vision equipment, cameras, and radio communication devices. The first several hours of surveillance revealed normal nocturnal activity, small mammals moving through the sugarcane, occasional bird calls, and the distant sounds of traffic from the main highway. Around 11:30, both Camila and Paulo noticed that the typical forest sounds had suddenly ceased, creating an unnatural quiet that extended across the entire area they were monitoring. Even the insects stopped chirping, leaving only the whisper of wind moving through the tall cane stalks. Paulo was providing running commentary into his digital recorder when his voice was suddenly cut off mid-sentence. Camila turned to see her assistant being dragged backward out of the hunting blind by something she could not clearly see in the darkness. Paulo's equipment scattered across the platform as he disappeared into the sugarcane field, and his brief cry of alarm was immediately muffled, as if something had covered his mouth. Camila activated her emergency radio and called for backup, but the nearest police station was 40 kilometers away and would require at least an hour to respond. She could hear thrashing sounds moving through the cane field, growing progressively fainter as whatever had taken Paulo moved deeper into the plantation. After 3 minutes of chaotic noise, complete silence returned to the area. Police arrived shortly after 1 in the morning, accompanied by firefighters and a search team with tracking dogs. They found Paulo's scattered equipment and clear signs of a struggle at the surveillance blind, but the dogs lost the scent trail after following it for only 200 meters into the sugarcane field. The searchers worked through the night and continued for 3 days, but Paulo Vasconcelos was never found. The official police investigation concluded that Paulo had likely been attacked by a jaguar, though investigators acknowledged that jaguars typically did not drag their prey for extended distances and rarely attacked humans without provocation. The case was classified as an animal attack with unusual circumstances, and Camila was instructed to file her report accordingly. However, Camila prepared a separate, detailed report documenting the unusual footprints, claw marks, and behavioral patterns she had observed. She included detailed sketches and descriptions of all the physical evidence, and her professional assessment that the attacks were not consistent with any known Brazilian predator. Her supervisor, Dr. Manuel Santos, reviewed the report and immediately ordered it sealed, stating that speculation about unknown creatures would damage the agency's credibility and interfere with legitimate conservation work. Local residents living near Santo Vento were not surprised by the incident. Several older farmers reported that their grandfathers had spoken of forest giants that occasionally emerged from the deep woods to challenge human intrusion into their territory. They described these beings as protectors of the ancient forest, creatures that demanded respect from anyone who ventured too close to the wildest parts of the preserve. The cattle mutilations continued sporadically for several months after Paulo's disappearance, though they gradually moved to different areas as word of the incident spread among local ranchers. Most farmers began keeping their livestock in barns at night and avoided the forest edge areas where the attacks had occurred. Camila Rodriguez resigned from the Environmental Protection Agency 6 weeks after Paulo's disappearance, citing personal stress and family obligations. She moved to Salvador and found work with a private environmental consulting firm, refusing all requests for interviews about the Santo Vento incident. Friends reported that she suffered from severe anxiety and would become visibly agitated whenever anyone mentioned wildlife attacks or forest conservation work. The hunting blind where Paulo disappeared was removed by local authorities, and the area was declared off-limits to researchers and visitors. Santo Vento Wildlife Preserve continued to operate, but staff members were instructed to conduct all fieldwork in groups and to avoid the southeastern section, where the preserve bordered the sugarcane plantations. Dr. Santos retired early in 2005 and took the sealed report with him, though he reportedly told his replacement that some things were better left unexplored. The official records of Paulo Vasconcelos' disappearance were transferred to state archives, where they remained classified as an ongoing investigation, despite the fact that no active search efforts continued beyond the initial week. The northern ridge of Mount Tateyama in Toyama Prefecture, Japan, encompassed over 40 square kilometers of pristine alpine forest, where ancient Japanese cedar and beech trees created a dense canopy that blocked most sunlight from reaching the forest floor. Ryota Hamada had been mountaineering for 15 years when he organized a winter expedition to Mount Tateyama's northern ridge in February 1982, an experienced climber who had successfully summited several peaks in the Japanese Alps. Ryota planned to lead a small group of intermediate hikers on a challenging 3-day trek through the region's most remote terrain. His team consisted of 4 climbers: Akiko Sato, a 28-year-old geology student from Tokyo University; Hiroshi Tanaka, a software engineer from Osaka; Kenji Nakamura, a high school teacher from Nagoya; and Yuki Yamamoto, a photographer documenting mountain wildlife for a nature magazine. The group began their ascent on February 18th, following a marked trail that would take them through heavy forest to an elevation of 1,800 meters before establishing their base camp near a sheltered ridge. Weather forecasts predicted clear conditions for the first 2 days, with a possible storm system approaching from the west on their planned departure date. Ryota felt confident that his team could complete the trek and return to the trailhead before any serious weather arrived. Their first day of hiking proceeded smoothly, despite temperatures well below freezing and snow depths that often reached their knees. The group made good time through the lower elevations, where the forest provided some protection from wind and they established their first camp at a traditional site used by mountaineering groups for decades. Ryota noted that they encountered no wildlife tracks in the snow, which was unusual for the area during winter months, when animals typically left clear signs of their movement patterns. The second day brought them to the more challenging terrain of the northern ridge, where exposed sections required careful navigation and the use of mountaineering equipment. Visibility remained excellent throughout the morning, allowing spectacular views of the surrounding peaks and valleys. The group reached their intended campsite around 3 in the afternoon and immediately began establishing their shelter before temperatures dropped further after sunset. As evening approached, heavy clouds moved in from the west much faster than forecasters had predicted, and visibility dropped dramatically as snow began falling. Ryota made the decision to prepare for an extended storm, ensuring that all equipment was properly secured and that the group had adequate food and fuel for several additional days if necessary. The temperature fell to -15 degrees Celsius by 8 o'clock, and wind speeds increased substantially as the storm system fully engulfed their position. Around 10:30 that night, as the group huddled in their tents listening to the howling wind, they began hearing what sounded like slow, measured footsteps moving around their campsite. The sounds were distinctly different from the random creaking and settling noises that tents typically make in high winds, and they seemed to follow a deliberate pattern as if something was methodically circling their small camp. Ryota later described the footsteps as heavy and purposeful, with a rhythm that suggested bipedal movement rather than the four-legged gait of bears or other known wildlife. The footsteps continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes approaching so close to the tents that the occupants could hear breathing sounds and what might have been sniffing, as if whatever was outside was investigating their presence. Despite their concerns, the group decided to remain in their shelters rather than venture outside in the dangerous storm conditions. None of them slept well, and they spent most of the night listening to the mysterious sounds and waiting for dawn. When morning arrived, the storm had largely passed, leaving behind clear skies and nearly 2 feet of fresh snow covering their campsite. As the group emerged from their tents to assess the situation, they discovered that one tent was empty. Akiko Sato was nowhere to be found. Her sleeping bag was cold and showed no signs of recent occupancy, and her personal equipment remained neatly arranged inside the tent. Yuki reported that she had fallen asleep shortly after midnight and heard nothing unusual until she woke at dawn to find Akiko missing. The tent's entrance zipper was closed from the inside, but a careful examination revealed that the fabric near the bottom had been cleanly cut, creating an opening large enough for a person to crawl through. Snow had blown into the tent through this opening, but there were no signs of a struggle inside. Outside the tent, the fresh snowfall had created a blank canvas that clearly showed the tracks of whatever had visited their camp during the night. Ryota found enormous barefoot prints leading from Akiko's tent toward the edge of the ridge, where they disappeared over a steep drop into the valley below. The prints measured 54 centimeters in length and showed clearly defined toe impressions, though they were far too large to have been made by any human. Following the trail for as far as safely possible, the group discovered Akiko's torn winter coat caught on branches about 300 meters downhill from their camp. The heavy-duty mountaineering jacket had been ripped apart with such force that the insulation was scattered across a wide area, creating a trail of bright yellow synthetic fill that stood out starkly against the white snow. Despite extensive searching, they found no other trace of their missing companion. Ryota made the difficult decision to abandon their expedition and hike out immediately to report Akiko's disappearance. The descent took most of the day through challenging conditions, and they reached the nearest ranger station shortly before dark. Search and rescue teams were dispatched the following morning, including helicopter support and experienced mountain rescue specialists equipped with avalanche detection equipment. The official search continued for 6 days, hampered by additional snowfall and dangerous avalanche conditions on the steep slopes where Akiko had apparently been taken. Rescue teams found her scattered equipment and more sections of torn clothing, but no trace of Akiko herself. The search was eventually called off when another storm system made helicopter operations impossible, and ground teams determined that survival in the extreme conditions was unlikely. The official investigation concluded that Akiko Sato had likely suffered from altitude-induced disorientation and wandered from the tent during the night, subsequently falling into a ravine where her body was buried by avalanche activity. The unusual circumstances of her disappearance were attributed to the extreme stress and disorientation that can affect mountaineers in severe weather conditions. However, investigators were unable to explain the large footprints found around the campsite or the systematic way in which Akiko's clothing had been torn and scattered. The incident report noted these anomalies, but offered no alternative explanation for what might have caused them. Ryota Hamada never returned to Mount Tateyama and gradually stopped mountaineering altogether over the following months. He found work as a technical instructor at a climbing school in Tokyo, where he taught rope techniques and safety procedures in controlled indoor environments. Friends noted that he became increasingly reluctant to discuss wilderness expeditions and would change the subject whenever anyone mentioned the Mount Tateyama incident. The other members of the expedition also abandoned serious mountaineering, though they maintained their silence about the specific details of what they had experienced during that terrifying night on the northern ridge. Mountaineering activity in the area declined noticeably as word of the incident circulated through Japan's climbing community. Glenree National Reserve in County Wicklow, Ireland, contained 8,000 hectares of ancient woodland, where mist-choked valleys created perfect hiding places for whatever lurked in the shadows. In September 1977, retired postal worker James Donnelly and his 17-year-old son Patrick arrived for a weekend birdwatching expedition, planning to observe the rare red kites recently reintroduced to the Wicklow Mountains. On Saturday morning, they discovered a 150-kilogram red deer carcass suspended 4 meters high in an oak tree near their campsite. No Irish predator possessed the strength to lift such massive prey to that height. The deer's neck was twisted at an impossible angle, and its ribs were crushed by tremendous pressure. Beneath the tree, enormous footprints measuring 41 centimeters showed human-like toe impressions, but belonged to something weighing at least 300 kilograms. Deep claw marks scarred the oak's bark from ground level to above the suspended carcass, suggesting something with hands rather than paws had climbed the tree. The marks appeared to have been made by fingers, with 4 parallel grooves creating a ladder-like pattern up the trunk. That night, Patrick experienced terrifying nightmares, screaming that something was watching them through their tent. He described a massive face covered in dark hair with human-like features, but far larger than any person, its eyes reflecting their lantern light. Each time Patrick screamed, the forest fell completely silent, as if every creature was holding its breath. Around 3 in the morning, heavy footsteps began circling their campsite with methodical precision. The sounds had a distinctly human rhythm, but were accompanied by low grunts that definitely did not come from any person. For nearly an hour, something large moved with purpose around their tent. At one point, the footsteps stopped directly outside, and both father and son heard deep, rhythmic breathing from something much larger than a human being. James decided to break camp at dawn. As they packed, they discovered their food supplies had been disturbed during the night. Sealed containers were opened and contents scattered, apparently by hands rather than teeth or claws. Their 30-kilogram cooler had been put to 20 meters from its original position. Before James could report their discoveries to authorities, radio news announced that another camper had disappeared in Glenree the previous weekend. Michael O'Brien, a solo hiker, had vanished from the same area where James and Patrick had been staying. Search teams found scattered camping equipment and signs of violent struggle near Arden Valley, but police concluded O'Brien had fallen into the ravine during poor visibility. James contacted investigators and provided detailed testimony about the footprints, claw marks, and their terrifying night. However, the police report made no mention of his account, and when he inquired about his statement, he was told the case was closed and his information was no longer needed. The section of Glenree that included Arden Valley was permanently closed in 1978, officially due to geological instability. local deer hunters began avoiding the area, reporting overwhelming unease near the fog-shrouded ravine. Patrick never camped again and developed a lasting forest phobia. James continued birdwatching, but limited himself to day trips, keeping detailed records of the incident in his personal journal. When James died in 1994, his daughter Margaret found the journal, but decided against publishing it after wildlife experts dismissed the account as fantasy. Wahroonga Rainforest Preserve in northern Queensland, Australia contained 18,000 hectares of ancient Gondwanan rainforest, where towering Kaiuri pines and strangler figs created a multi-layered canopy that blocked sunlight from reaching the forest floor. In March 2000, documentary filmmakers Elliot Granger, Tanya Wolfe, Denny Coster, and Mei Lin received special permits to film rare tree frogs in the preserve's most remote sections, areas that bordered traditional Aboriginal lands and had remained largely unexplored by researchers. The team consisted of experienced nature documentarians who had worked together on previous projects throughout Australia and Southeast Asia. Elliot served as director and camera operator. Tanya handled sound recording and equipment maintenance. Denny managed lighting and technical support, while Mei Lin documented their scientific observations and coordinated with local Aboriginal guides who had provided cultural clearance for their research. They established base camp at a designated site 3 kilometers from the nearest access road, where a small clearing provided enough space for their tents and equipment. The location offered access to several creek systems where they hoped to find populations of the endangered Kuranda tree frog, a species that had not been photographed in its natural habitat for over 15 years. Their first day proceeded successfully, with the team locating and filming several frog species while documenting the pristine ecosystem. As evening approached, they prepared for night filming when many amphibian species would be most active. However, Tanya noticed that the typical sounds of nocturnal wildlife seemed unusually subdued, with fewer bird calls and insect noises than expected for such a pristine rainforest environment. On their second night, something began stalking their campsite. Elliot later described sensing a presence watching them from the darkness beyond their lighting equipment, though they could see nothing in the dense vegetation surrounding their camp. The feeling of being observed was so intense that all 4 team members commented on it, despite their extensive experience working in remote wilderness locations. Denny Coster disappeared sometime between hidden night and dawn on their second night. He had been sleeping in a tent positioned at the edge of their campsite, closest to the forest. When the others awakened, they found his tent empty, with no signs of struggle inside. His sleeping bag was cold and showed no indication of recent occupancy, and his personal equipment remained neatly arranged. Outside Denny's tent, the team discovered that the ground had been disturbed in a pattern suggesting something large had approached the shelter during the night. More troubling were the enormous footprints they found in the soft earth near the creek, measuring over 50 centimeters in length, with clearly defined toe impressions that looked disturbingly human-like despite their massive size. The remaining 3 team members spent the following day searching for Denny and calling his name throughout the surrounding forest. They found no trace of their missing colleague and decided to establish additional security measures for their final night before hiking out to report his disappearance. Using their technical equipment, they created a perimeter of tripwire alarms around their campsite, connected to battery-powered lights and sound devices that would activate if anything large approached their position. At 3 in the morning, one of the perimeter alarms triggered with a sharp electronic beep that echoed through the forest. Within seconds, something massive crashed through their campsite with incredible speed and violence, moving so quickly that none of the survivors could clearly see what was attacking them. Equipment was scattered and destroyed as the creature tore straight through the center of their camp, apparently focused on reaching the area where the humans were sleeping. Elliot managed to activate a high-powered spotlight during the attack and caught a brief glimpse of something that he later described as bipedal, covered in dark hair and standing at least 3 meters tall. The creature's eyes reflected the light with an unnatural intensity, and its movements were far too quick and coordinated to belong to any known Australian wildlife. The entire assault lasted less than 30 seconds before the creature crashed back into the forest, leaving behind a scene of total destruction. When dawn arrived, they found Tanya Wolf's body 50 meters from their destroyed campsite, crushed against a large boulder, as if she had been hurled through the air with tremendous force. Her injuries were so severe that they could not have been caused by any native predator, and the location of her body suggested she had been thrown rather than dragged or carried. Elliot and Mei Lin abandoned their remaining equipment and hiked out of the preserve immediately, reaching the access road by late afternoon. Queensland Police and Parks and Wildlife Service rangers responded to their report and conducted an extensive search of the area, but found no trace of Denny Coster, despite using helicopters and trained tracking dogs. The official investigation concluded that the team had been attacked by a cassowary, one of Australia's largest and most dangerous native birds. Investigators noted that cassowaries were known to be aggressive and territorial, capable of inflicting fatal injuries with their powerful legs and razor-sharp claws. Tanya's death was officially attributed to a cassowary attack, and Denny's disappearance was classified as a separate incident, possibly involving a fall into one of the area's deep ravines. However, the physical evidence did not support the cassowary theory. The footprints found at the campsite were far too large and showed toe patterns completely unlike those of any bird. The systematic destruction of their equipment and the organized nature of the attack suggested intelligence rather than the random aggression typical of animal encounters. Elliot Granger never worked on another nature documentary and required extensive psychological counseling to deal with the trauma of the incident. He insisted to investigators that whatever attacked them was not a bird, but something far more dangerous that had been watching and stalking them long before it revealed itself. Friends reported that he suffered from severe nightmares and would become visibly agitated whenever anyone mentioned cassowaries or Australian wildlife. The section of Wahroonga Rainforest Preserve where the incident occurred was temporarily closed to researchers and visitors, though it was quietly reopened 6 months later with additional safety restrictions. Local Aboriginal elders were not surprised by the attack, noting that their traditional stories had always warned against venturing too deep into certain parts of the ancient forest, where ancestral guardians still protected the land from intrusion.